February 11th, 2025. On February 12, 1809, Nancy Hanks Lincoln gave birth to her second child, a son, Abraham. Abraham Lincoln grew up to become the nation's 16th president, leading the country from March 1861 until his assassination in April 1865, a little over a month into his second term. He piloted the country through the Civil War, preserving the concept of American democracy. It was a system that had never been fully realized, but that he still saw as the last best hope of Earth to prove that people could govern themselves. Lincoln grew up in rural poverty as wealthy enslavers took over prime land in his family's home state of Kentucky and pushed them across the Ohio River to Indiana, where Nancy Lincoln died. From there, they moved on to the frontier state of Illinois, where Abraham sowed seed, hoed fields, grubbed roots, cut trees, made fences, and harvested crops, both at home and for farmers to whom his father hired him out for wages, for the elder Lincoln never managed to get his feet under him after leaving Kentucky. In 1831, finally an adult, Abraham set out to make his mark in the world, as did thousands of other young men in his dynamic era. But making it on his own wasn't much easier for the young Lincoln than it had been for his father. He settled in the town of New Salem, a village of about 100 people on a bluff above the Sangamon River, where he failed as a storekeeper, then cobbled together various jobs, eking out a living splitting rails and making deliveries. Government appointments, first as a postmaster and then as a surveyor, kept him afloat and made him well enough known that in 1834 voters elected him to the state legislature, and he was on his way to prominence. Lincoln's time as a young man on the make had made him think hard about the relationship between Americans and their government. In his era, elite Southern enslavers insisted that government had no role to play in the country except in protecting property, a concept of government that permitted them to amass fortunes thanks to the labor of their black neighbors. But Lincoln had watched his town of New Salem die because its settlers, hard workers eager to make the town succeed, could not dredge the Sangamon River to promote trade by themselves. Lincoln later mused, "The legitimate object of government is to do for the people what needs to be done, but which they cannot, by individual effort, do at all or do so well for themselves. As public roads and highways, public schools, charities, pauperism, orphanage, estates of the deceased, and the machinery of government itself." Once elected to the presidency, Lincoln joined with members of his new Republican Party to make the government work for the American people. They created national money and the income tax. They took land from speculators and gave it to men willing to farm it. They established public colleges to enable poor men to get an education, the Department of Agriculture to make sure poor men had access to good seeds, and transcontinental railroads so poor men could both get to Western lands and get their products back to Eastern markets. And they used the power of the federal government to end human enslavement in the United States, except as punishment for crime. A generation later, under Republican President Theodore Roosevelt, progressives at the turn of the 20th century expanded on Lincoln's understanding of the role of government in supporting the American people. In that era, corrupt industrialists increased their profits by abusing their workers, adulterating milk with formaldehyde, and painting candies with lead paint, dumping toxic waste into neighborhoods, and paying legislators to let them do whatever they wished. Those concerned about the survival of democracy worried that individuals were not actually free when their lives were controlled by the corporations that poisoned their food and water, while making it impossible for individuals to get an education or make enough money ever to become independent. To restore the rights of individuals, progressives of both parties argued that individuals needed a strong, active government to protect them from the excesses and powerful industrialists of the modern world. Under the new governmental system that Theodore Roosevelt pioneered, the government cleaned up the sewage systems and tenements in cities, protected public lands, invested in public health and education, raised taxes, and called for universal health insurance, all to protect the ability of individuals to live freely without being crushed by outside influences. Reformers sought, as Roosevelt said, to return to an economic system under which each man shall be guaranteed the opportunity to show the best that there is in him. In the 1920s, the idea that the government should be run as a business eclipsed Roosevelt's progressive government. But after the great crash of 1929 and the ensuing Depression, Democrats under Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the 1930s offered a New Deal for the American people. That New Deal meant that the government would no longer work simply to promote business, but would also regulate business, provide a basic social safety net, and promote infrastructure. World War II accelerated the construction of that active government, and by the time it was over, Americans quite liked the new system. After the war, Republican Dwight Eisenhower embraced the active government. He explained that in the modern world, the government must protect people from disasters created by forces outside their control, and it must provide social services that would protect people from unemployment, old age, illness, accidents, unsafe food and drugs, homelessness, and disease. He called his version of the New Deal a middle way between untrammeled freedom of the individual and the demands of the welfare of the whole nation. One of his supporters echoed Lincoln when he explained, "If a job has to be done to meet the needs of the people, and no one else can do it, then it is the proper function of the federal government." Both Republicans and Democrats embraced this idea, which became known as the liberal consensus. In the second half of the 20th century, they expanded the role of government to protect civil rights, the environment, access to health care and education, equal opportunity and employment, and so on. But those who objected to the liberal consensus rejected the idea that the government had any role to play in the economy or in social welfare, and made no distinction between the liberal consensus and international communism. They insisted that the country was made up of liberals who were pushing the nation towards socialism, and conservatives, like themselves, who were standing alone against the Democrats and Republicans who made up a majority of the country and liked the new business regulations, safety net, infrastructure, and protection of civil rights. That reactionary mindset came to dominate the Republican Party after Ronald Reagan's election in 1980. Republicans began to insist that anyone who embraced the liberal consensus of the past several decades was un-American and had no right to govern, no matter how many Americans supported that ideology. And now, 45 years later, we are watching as a group of reactionaries dismantle the government that serves the needs of ordinary Americans and work, once again, to concentrate wealth and power in the hands of an elite. The idea of a small government that serves the needs of a few wealthy people, Lincoln warned in his era, is the same old serpent that says, "You work and I eat. You toil and I will enjoy the fruits of it. Turn in whatever way you will, whether it come from the mouth of a king, an excuse for enslaving the people of his country, or from the mouth of men of one race as a reason for enslaving the men of another race. It is all the same old serpent."
Letters from an American was produced at Soundscape Productions, Dedham, Massachusetts. Recorded with music composed by Michael Moss.